The air did not smell of winter or rain, but of something heavy, sweet, and utterly wrong. It was a thick, greasy fog that clung to the back of my throat, tasting of burnt copper and old memories. Above us, the sky was a bruised purple, choked by a constant rain of gray flakes that never melted on the skin. We were told it was snow, but the warmth of the particles told a much darker story. Every breath felt like a betrayal of those who had already been consumed by the furnace. I would eventually stand before a man of stone, feeling the bite of the lash and the warmth of my own blood. I did not know then that I was merely a number in a game of death where survival was the only rule. Long before the iron gates and the chimneys, my world was filled with the scent of honey and the sound of my father's laughter. We lived in the heart of a bustling city where the cobblestones felt like permanent foundations. My father owned a small factory that produced delicate honey-dipped wafers wrapped in gleaming silver foil. Our home was a sanctuary of 7 souls, bound by traditions and the pursuit of knowledge. I spent my days in the hallowed halls of our local academy, studying the ancient texts until my eyes grew weary. My father would return every evening with his pockets bulging with the day's production, letting us hunt for the silver-wrapped treats. It was a life of simple joys and profound security that felt as though it would last forever. We were a family of faith, believing that the goodness of the world would always shield us from the dark. Then the shadows began to stretch across our borders, and the laughter in our house slowly turned to whispers. The transition was not a sudden explosion, but a creeping frost that withered everything it touched. First, the businesses were seized under the guise of new regulations, and then the schools were shuttered for children of our heritage. We were suddenly strangers in the very streets where we had been born and raised. By the 5th day of the official occupation, the heavy boots of the invaders were echoing in our courtyard. They pounded on the grand wooden gates of our apartment building with a violence that shook the glass in the windows. Our landlord, a man we had known for years, did not hesitate to point the way to our door. The intrusion happened at 5 in the morning while the world was still draped in a fragile gray light. They did not knock. They shattered the frame with the butts of their rifles and swarmed into our bedrooms. I remember the cold steel of a pistol pressed against my father's temple as he was dragged from his bed. They threw open large canvas sacks and screamed for every ounce of gold, jewelry, and currency we possessed. My sister Clara and I stood paralyzed as we watched them ransack our history in a matter of minutes. From the apartment next door, a piercing, high-pitched scream erupted that sounded like the end of the world. Clara and I slipped through the connecting kitchen door, drawn by a primal instinct to help our neighbors. What we saw in that dimly lit room remains a jagged shard in my mind that time can never dull. A soldier stood there, holding a tiny infant by its legs as if it were nothing more than a piece of livestock. He was swinging the child through the air, mocking the parents who were weeping and begging for mercy on their knees. With a sickening, nonchalant smirk, he swung the child one last time into the heavy oak doorpost. The silence that followed was far more terrifying than the screaming that had preceded it. My father decided then that we could no longer stay in the city, and we began preparing for the forced relocation. While he was packing our few remaining clothes, a young man named Julian approached him with a desperate request. Julian had long loved Clara, and he begged my father to let him join our family on whatever path lay ahead. My father gave him a choice between the large, centralized camp or a smaller, more remote community in the foothills. Julian chose the smaller community, a decision that would become the first of many inexplicable miracles. We later learned that every soul sent to the larger camp was erased from existence within 48 hours of their arrival. In that remote community, we lived in a cramped farmhouse divided between ourselves and the local owner. My father, ever resilient, became a baker for the village to ensure we had enough scraps to survive another day. I was only 12 years old then, learning the art of the hearth while the world outside burned. We lived in a state of suspended animation for over a year, clinging to the rhythm of the rising dough. Clara and Julian were married in a quiet, hushed ceremony that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. They moved into a small duplex owned by the local mayor, a man who still held a flicker of humanity. One evening, the mayor came to Julian with a look of pure terror etched into his weathered face. He whispered that a massive raid was scheduled for the following night to cleanse the village of our people. Julian did not wait for the sun to rise. He hired a horse and wagon in the dead of night and smuggled us away. This was the second miracle, as the dawn brought trucks and soldiers who rounded up every remaining family. They were taken to the nearby forest, handed shovels to dig their own graves, and executed by the thousands. We were already miles away, heading toward a place known as the Crimson District. The Crimson District was a walled off nightmare where the air was thick with the scent of fear and unwashed bodies. It had a reputation for brutality that made even the bravest men tremble at the mention of its name. Every few weeks, heavy trucks would rumble through the gates in the middle of the night to snatch children from their beds. The parents would chase the vehicles, screaming for their babies, only to be cut down by the machine guns mounted on the tailgates. We lived in a constant state of readiness, knowing that our turn could come with the next turn of the wheels. A friendly officer eventually warned Julian that a final liquidation of our block was imminent. We had prepared a hidden bunker behind a large, ornate wardrobe that sat against the back wall of our room. As the heavy boots began to hammer on the street outside, 12 of us scrambled through a sliding panel in the furniture. We stood in a narrow, lightless gap between two buildings, feeling the freezing snow fall through the open rafters above. The sounds of the night were a symphony of barking dogs, shattering glass, and the screams of people being dragged into the dark. We stood frozen, our breath hitching in our chests, as we listened to the systematic destruction of our neighbors. The cold was a physical weight, but the terror was what truly kept our blood from freezing. When the sun finally rose and the trucks departed, we dared to slide the panel open and step back into the world. The scene in the courtyard was a vision of hell that no artist could ever truly capture. People lay scattered in the red-stained snow, their bodies partially torn apart by the hounds that had been set upon them. Some were still moving, their fingers twitching in the slush as life slowly drained away into the frozen earth. Guards were moving about with carts, piling the bodies into a massive mound in the center of the square. They doused the heap with gasoline and ignited a bonfire of human remains that burned with an oily black smoke. My heart sank as I realized Clara was not with us, having been hidden in a different location across the street. I ran to the small structure where she was supposed to be, a hollowed-out space beneath a kennel. I lifted the floorboards with trembling hands, expecting to see her face looking back at me from the dark. Instead, I found 7 bodies lying in the dirt, each with a single hole in the center of their forehead. My sister was not among them, and for a moment I did not know whether to scream or pray. I later found her and Julian shivering in a leather tannery, where they had stood knee-deep in freezing water all night. We realized that our time in the Northern Territories was over, and we made a desperate run for the border. We hid in a double-decker coal truck, squeezed into a narrow gap between the heavy chassis and the black fuel. The dust choked us, and the heat was unbearable, but we crossed the frontier into the Southern Republic. For a few months, we lived in a state of fragile peace, believing that we had finally outrun the reach of the monster. This was the summer of 1943, and the sun felt warm on our faces for the first time in years. But the monster was merely catching its breath before the final, most brutal surge of the campaign. In March of 1944, the invaders marched into the Southern Republic with a list of every address and name. They told us we were being relocated to help with the industrial efforts of the great realm. We were ordered to pack only what we could carry and to leave our homes unlocked and ready for new occupants. They herded 82 of us into a single wooden cattle car, sliding the heavy iron bolt into place from the outside. There was no light, no ventilation, and no hope as the train began its slow, rhythmic journey into the abyss. We sat on our bundles of clothing to keep ourselves off the floor, which was quickly becoming a swamp of filth. For 3 days and 3 nights, the train moved through a landscape of nightmares without a single stop for water. The air became so thick with the stench of human waste and sweat that it felt like a physical barrier to breathing. People began to lose their minds in the darkness, wailing for their mothers or fighting over a handful of spilled crumbs. My little brother Leo clung to my arm with a grip that left bruises on my skin. We arrived at a place the sign called the Ash Fields, but the world would come to know it by a much darker name. The doors were flung open, and the sudden light was as painful as a physical blow to the eyes. The guards screamed at us to leave everything behind and form two separate lines based on our gender. I held on to Leo and Clara for as long as I could, but the tide of humanity pulled us apart with a ruthless efficiency. I saw Clara and Leo being led toward a brick building with a tall chimney that was already belching thick smoke. I did not know then that I would never see their faces again or hear the sound of their voices. I was diverted into the line of men, moving toward a figure who stood with a silver-tipped cane and a cold, clinical gaze. This was Dr. Volkov, the man who decided the fate of thousands with a flick of his wrist. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to see through my flesh and into my very bones. He asked if I was capable of running 5 kilometers or if I would prefer to take the truck to the barracks. I saw a young man ahead of me choose the truck because of a slight limp, and he was sent to the right. Something in my gut told me that the truck was a deception, a shortcut to the very chimney I had seen earlier. I stood as tall as I could, saluted the doctor, and lied about my age to appear more valuable. I told him I was 18, healthy, and ready for whatever labor the realm required of me. He pointed his cane to the left, and I followed my uncle and cousin into a large, cold auditorium. We were stripped of our clothes, our dignity, and the very hair on our heads until we were identical ghosts. I had hidden a small cache of diamonds in the heels of my heavy black boots, refusing to let them go. I stood naked in those boots while the barbers sheared us, praying that no guard would notice the quality of my footwear. If they had discovered the hidden stones, I would have been executed on the spot as an example to the others. Miraculously, I was marched to the barracks with my secret still intact and my life still mine. The man in charge of our block was a seasoned inmate who had lost his soul long before we arrived. He pointed toward the horizon where the orange flames licked the night sky and the gray flakes fell like ash. He told us that those flames were fed by the bodies of our mothers, our fathers, and our siblings. He laughed at our disbelief, telling us that we were in a factory of death where the only product was ash. I looked at the sky and thought of Leo and Clara, refusing to believe that they were now nothing more than smoke. It was the 20th century, and the world was supposed to be a place of reason and progress. After 5 weeks of starvation, we were moved to a place called Stonegate to work in a massive rock quarry. Our task was to break boulders into gravel using heavy sledgehammers and our own dwindling strength. We pushed heavy mining carts up steep inclines, our hands bleeding and our backs screaming under the strain. I knew my uncle would not survive the intensity of the labor for more than a few days. I used the diamonds from my boots to bribe the kitchen supervisor, securing my uncle a position indoors. It was a small victory in a landscape of total defeat, but it gave us a reason to keep breathing. Every evening, we were forced to stand in long, perfectly straight lines to be counted by the camp commandant. One day the counting did not stop, and the commandant arrived with his mistress to oversee a special punishment. 3 men had attempted to escape the previous night, and the entire camp was to pay the price for their defiance. He ordered his guards to pull every 10th man from the line to receive 25 lashes with a hardwood cane. I realized with a jolt of terror that my uncle was in the 10th position in our row. I reached out, grabbed his shoulder, and pulled him behind me, stepping into the path of the guards. They led the group of us into the center of the yard, where a wooden sawhorse had been placed on the dirt. We were ordered to bend over the frame without touching the crossbar with our stomachs or the ground with our heels. If we touched either, or if we miscounted the strikes, the punishment would begin again from the very first lash. The first man in line failed to hold his position and was shot in the head by the commandant without a second thought. The second and third men met the same fate, their bodies left in the dust as a warning to the rest of us. Then the guard called my name and ordered me to take my place at the horse. I remember the grit of the earth between my toes and the silence of 1,000 men holding their collective breath. I focused every ounce of my will on the numbers, counting each strike out loud as the wood tore into my flesh. I felt the warm trail of blood running down my legs, but I did not let my heels touch the ground. When the 25th strike landed, I was still standing, though the world was spinning in a haze of red and gray. The guard told me to thank the commandant for his mercy, and I obeyed, saluting with a hand that shook like a leaf. The commandant used me as an example of how a disciplined prisoner should behave before turning his attention away. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, the 3 escapees were dragged through the gates, beaten beyond recognition. The commandant lost interest in our punishment as if he were a child bored with a broken toy. He ordered the remaining 10th men back into line and had a portable gallows erected in the center of the square. We were forced to watch as the 3 men were hanged, their bodies twitching in the cold wind of the coming night. One of them began to whisper a final prayer, but the stool was kicked away before he could finish the holy words. We stood there until the sun went down, staring at the cost of hope in a place without light. As the front lines of the war drew closer, we were forced onto a final march that lasted for 7 agonizing weeks. We walked 460 kilometers through the snow, leaving a trail of bodies behind us like breadcrumbs. Those who could not keep the pace were executed where they fell, their blood marking the path for those of us still moving. We eventually arrived at a secondary transit station where 80 of us were shoved into a single cattle car. This journey was shorter in distance but far more brutal in its lack of resources and human compassion. After an hour in the darkness, the guards threw 80 loaves of bread into the car and slammed the door. A riot erupted instantly as men fought like animals over the limited supply of food in the pitch black. I tried to climb over the pile of bodies to reach a loaf for my cousin and myself, feeling the desperation of a dying man. Someone in the darkness drew a pocket knife and plunged it through my cheek, the blade piercing my tongue. I felt my mouth fill with the metallic taste of blood, but I did not let go of the bread I had seized. I crawled back to the wall and shared the ration with my cousin, making it last for the next 14 days. By the time the doors opened again, only 4 of us were left alive out of the original 80. We had arrived at our final destination, a place called the Iron Gate, where the guards had already fled. 3 days later, the gates were crushed by the weight of massive green tanks and men in uniforms I didn't recognize. 2 soldiers walked up to me and handed me a can of processed meat, their faces filled with a pity I couldn't understand. I ate the rich food with a hunger that bypassed my reason, not knowing that my body was too weak to process it. My cousin died in my arms that very night, his heart giving out just as the world was becoming safe again. I sat with him in the silence, wondering why I had been the one to walk out of the dark. I have spent the last several decades traveling across the globe, telling this story to anyone who will listen to my voice. People ask me how I survived the weight of so much shadow without losing my mind or my heart. I tell them that I was chosen to be a witness, a living bridge between the dead and the living. It is a burden that brings me many sleepless nights and a grief that never truly leaves my bones. But as long as I have breath in my lungs, I will tell the world about the silver wafers and the human bonfires. We must remember the ash, or we are condemned to let the fires burn once again. Would you like me to translate this narrative into Turkish or perhaps adjust the tone for a different audience?